January 1941, North Atlantic. Before dawn, the sea is iron black, restless, breathing against the hulls of 40 merchant ships, moving east in silence. No lights, no smoke, only the slow churn of propellers and the creak of steel under winter swell. Somewhere below, the water carries sound farther than sight ever could. Inside a German U-boat, headphones pressed tight against the sonar operator's ears, he listens for the familiar rhythm propeller's cavitation, the unmistakable signature of a convoy. This is how ships die now. Not by gunfire, not by warning, but by detection. Yet tonight, something is wrong. The ocean answers back with noise that makes no sense. A fog of sound, echoes that bend, scatter, dissolve before they return. The convoy should be here. The math says it should be here. But the water refuses to speak clearly. Above, an Allied escort destroyer cuts through the swell. Along its stern, something unseen churns beneath the surface. Not a weapon, not armor, but a simple disturbance that turns physics against the hunter. It began as an observation, not from a scientist, not from an admiral, but from someone the war was never supposed to hear from. And as the Atlantic waits, the balance between hunter and hunted starts to shift toward something unexpected. By the winter of 1941, the Atlantic Ocean had become the most dangerous supply route on Earth. Britain was an island at war, dependent on sea lanes that stretched thousands of miles across open water. Every ton of grain, fuel, steel, and ammunition had to pass through this narrow, exposed artery. The German Navy understood this with brutal clarity. They did not need to invade Britain. They only needed to starve it. At the center of that strategy stood the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, under the direction of Großadmiral Karl Dönitz. German submarines were deployed not as solitary hunters, but as coordinated predators. The doctrine was simple and devastating. U-boats would patrol wide ocean areas alone. When one sighted a convoy, it would shadow the ships and radio their position. Others would converge. At night, on the surface, they would attack in packs. Wolf packs, overwhelming escorts through speed, surprise, and confusion. Between September 1939 and the end of 1941, this method inflicted catastrophic losses. In 1940 alone, Allied merchant shipping losses exceeded 4 million gross tons. Ships vanished faster than they could be built. Crews drowned in black water without ever seeing the enemy. Detection was the foundation of this killing machine. German submarines relied heavily on hydrophones, passive listening devices that could detect propeller noise from miles away. Sound traveled efficiently through seawater, especially in the cold North Atlantic. A convoy could be heard long before it could be seen, long before it could defend itself. The Allies were not blind to the threat. The Royal Navy had entered the war with ASDIC, an early form of active sonar developed between the wars. In theory, it could locate submerged submarines by emitting sound pulses and listening for echoes. In practice, it was unreliable, short-ranged, and vulnerable to environmental interference. Rough seas, thermal layers, and simple evasive maneuvers could break contact. Still, ASDIC was all the Allies had. Escort vessels, destroyers, corvettes, trawlers hastily converted for war were spread thin across vast ocean spaces. A single convoy might have only 3 or 4 escorts guarding dozens of merchant ships. Once a submarine slipped past them, the convoy was exposed. By 1941, the situation was deteriorating. German submarines were growing more capable. The crews were experienced. Tactics were refined. Allied losses climbed steadily as the U-boats pushed farther west into areas with little to no air cover. The ocean itself seemed to favor the hunter. Inside the Admiralty in London, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Charts showed shipping losses rising faster than replacement. Reports from convoy commanders were grim and repetitive. Contact lost. Enemy escaped. Torpedo. Tracks sighted too late. The war at sea had become a war of acoustics. Whoever controlled sound, controlled survival. And as Allied scientists and naval officers studied equations and test tanks, searching for answers in laboratories and classified reports, the most dangerous enemy was not steel or explosives, but the unbroken clarity of water itself. Because as long as sound traveled cleanly through the Atlantic, the U-boats would keep finding their prey. And that realization opened the door to a different kind of thinking. This was the uncomfortable truth facing Allied navies as the Battle of the Atlantic deepened. On land, noise dissipates quickly. In air, it scatters. weakens, and dies. But in seawater, sound travels faster, farther, and with unnerving persistence. Cold, dense Atlantic water carried low-frequency noise for miles with little loss of strength. A turning propeller, a vibrating shaft, even the rhythmic pulse of engines could betray a ship's presence long before it crossed the horizon. German submariners understood this intimately. Hydrophone operators were trained to identify ships not by sight, but by sound signatures, the number of blades on a propeller, the spacing of the engine beats, the difference between a loaded tanker and an empty freighter. To them, the ocean was not silent. It was crowded with information. Allied acoustic systems attempted to fight sound with sound. A sharp acoustic pulse was sent into the water, bouncing off a submarine's hull and returning as an echo. But this technology came with severe limitations. It required the escort ship to point directly at the target. It struggled at close range, and it failed entirely if the submarine slipped beneath thermal layers, natural temperature gradients that bent sound waves away from their source. Even worse, ASDIC revealed the escort's position every time it was used. Once an escort ship began transmitting, a skilled U-boat commander could estimate its distance and heading. Sound cut both ways. The deeper problem, however, was not the machines. It was the environment. The Atlantic was chaotic. Waves, storms, plankton layers, salinity shifts, and seabed reflections all interfered with sonar performance. Every ping was distorted by conditions that could change hour by hour. In this underwater battlefield, physics refused to behave predictably. Allied scientists understood these principles in theory. Naval research establishments ran experiments with tanks, charts, and controlled environments, but the ocean was not controlled, and wartime urgency left little room for perfect solutions. Before 1941, countermeasures were limited and crude. Convoys zigzagged to confuse targeting calculations. Engines were sometimes slowed to reduce noise at the cost of speed and safety. Escorts dropped depth charges not always to kill, but to disrupt sonar contact long enough for convoys to escape. None of it addressed the core issue. As long as the water remained acoustically transparent, submarines would continue to listen. What the Allies needed was not a better weapon, but a way to change the ocean itself to interfere with sound, to scatter it, to break it into useless fragments. This idea ran against conventional naval thinking. Water was assumed to be a constant, something ships moved through, not something that could be altered. Interfering with the medium itself sounded impractical, even absurd. Yet in small corners of the Royal Navy, desperation loosened orthodoxy. The Admiralty quietly began listening to unconventional proposals. Not all came from physicists or engineers. Some came from sailors, mechanics, civilians, attached to naval bases who had spent years watching how water behaved around ships. Men who noticed patterns without equations. Among them was a former merchant seaman turned naval auxiliary, a man whose wartime duties had little to do with weapons or strategy, someone who spent more time near galley equipment than sonar rooms. He noticed something most experts had ignored. When water was filled with bubbles, sound did not travel the same way. It bent, it scattered, it weakened at first. It sounded like nonsense, but in a war where the ocean itself had become the enemy's greatest ally, even an idea that seemed insane was suddenly worth testing, and that quiet willingness to experiment would soon follow Allied ships out into the darkness of the Atlantic. The Second World War is often told through admirals, scientists, and machines with serial numbers, but behind the steel and equations stood thousands of overlooked individuals, whose proximity to the ocean gave them a different kind of knowledge. William J. Forster was not a naval engineer. He was not a physicist. He did not wear an officer's uniform. Before the war, he had worked in civilian maritime jobs, merchant vessels, dockyards, and support roles where survival depended on observation rather than theory. When war came, Forster found himself attached to naval facilities in Britain in a logistical capacity. His work revolved around sustenance, maintenance, and the unnoticed routines that kept ships functioning, and that was precisely why he noticed something others did not. Near boilers, pipes, and water systems, Forster watched how bubbles behaved. He saw how boiling water distorted the sound, how noise softened, fractured, and vanished when trapped inside churning pockets of air. It was not academic insight. It was experiential, repeated, unavoidable. In peacetime, such observations meant nothing. In wartime, they became questions. If bubbles could disrupt sound in confined spaces, what would they do in open water? Foster did not frame his idea in formulas. He framed it in plain language, too plain for comfort. He suggested that streams of bubbles released behind ships might interfere with sonar detection, that the ocean itself could be made noisy enough to confuse a listener. To trained scientists, it sounded like barroom speculation. But war has a way of lowering thresholds, and when every orthodox solution had failed to slow the sinking of ships, the Navy listened quietly, cautiously to a man whose job description placed him far from the war's intellectual center. Because sometimes proximity to reality matters more than credentials, and that reality was sound behaving badly in water, filled with air. From a physics standpoint, the idea was deceptively simple. Sound travels through water as pressure waves. When those waves encounter a uniform medium, they remain coherent. But when they encounter abrupt changes like air trapped in water, the wave energy scatters, reflections multiply, direction becomes ambiguous. Bubbles are acoustic disruptors. Each bubble acts as a miniature boundary between two vastly different densities. Sound entering a bubble does not pass through cleanly. It refracts, reflects, or collapses. Multiply that effect by thousands of bubbles, and the result is an acoustic fog. In controlled environments, this effect was known. In naval warfare, it had never been applied deliberately. The difficulty lay in scale. Creating enough bubbles consistently behind a moving ship required equipment that did not yet exist. Pumps, pipes, and exhaust systems would have to be modified. Energy would be diverted. Maintenance would increase. There were legitimate concerns about practicality, but the principle held. Early tests, crude, limited, undocumented in details, showed promising results. ASDIC signals passing through bubble layers returned fragmented echoes. Hydrophone readings became erratic. Operators reported noise where clarity should have been, not silence. Confusion. And confusion was enough, because sonar did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. It only needed to be made unreliable. For the first time, Allied planners began considering counterdetection as a viable strategy, not hiding ships completely, but making them acoustically ambiguous. Technology, in this case, did not advance through complexity. It advanced by exploiting a weakness in nature itself, and once that weakness was understood, tactics could be built around it. Convoy warfare was a game of margins. An escort did not need to sink every submarine. It only needed to delay detection long enough for the convoy to pass. Minutes mattered, sometimes seconds. If a U-boat failed to establish firm contact, it could not shadow effectively. If it could not shadow, it could not call in the pack. And without the pack, attacks became isolated and risky. Bubble-based interference offered something escorts had never possessed before: control over the acoustic battlefield. When deployed behind a ship, a bubble stream could mask engine noise, distort bearing estimates, and confuse hydrophone operators attempting to track movement. Even if the U-boat suspected deception, uncertainty slowed decision-making. And in convoy warfare, hesitation was lethal. Tactically, the idea complemented existing methods. Escorts could deploy bubble screens while maneuvering aggressively, forcing submarines to choose between evasion and pursuit. Convoys gained breathing room space, measured not in miles, but in time. No single escort tactic won the Atlantic, but this one addressed the war's invisible dimension. Sound. For the first time, Allied ships were not merely reacting to detection, they were shaping it, and that realization marked a quiet shift from defense to denial, from being heard to making hearing meaningless. The Atlantic was beginning to change. Hydrophone operators sat hunched in narrow compartments, eyes closed, minds focused entirely on sound. They were trained to trust what they heard more than what they saw. Bearings were called out in degrees. Speed was estimated by rhythm, distance by volume and clarity. This was not guesswork. It was a practiced, almost intimate relationship with the ocean, which is why the new sounds were so unsettling. Reports began to surface quietly at first of contacts that refused to behave normally. Bearings shifted without explanation. Propeller beats seemed to fracture, then vanish, only to reappear somewhere else. The water felt crowded with meaningless noise. Two German operators. It was as if the ocean itself had developed a stutter. At first, these incidents were dismissed as operator error or poor conditions. The Atlantic was notorious for false readings. But patterns emerged. Certain convoys were harder to track. Certain escorts seemed to erase clarity as they maneuvered. U-boat commanders depended on certainty. Shadowing a convoy required hours, sometimes days of persistent contact. Any ambiguity increased the risk of detection by escorts. Any delay weakened coordination with other submarines. Confusion bred caution. And caution in a submarine war meant missed opportunities. German naval intelligence struggled to explain the phenomenon. There was no obvious new weapon, no dramatic technological leap, just a gradual erosion of acoustic dominance. The hunter was still listening, but the ocean was no longer answering cleanly. Naval leadership during the Battle of the Atlantic was conservative by necessity. Lives and national survival were at stake. Any new idea had to survive layers of skepticism, testing, and bureaucratic resistance. Bubble-based countermeasures sat uneasily within that system. They did not resemble weapons. They produced no explosions. Their effectiveness was difficult to quantify. Reports were subjective. Sonar operators described confused returns, rather than measurable kills. Yet senior officers understood something crucial. The war was not being lost because escorts lacked courage or firepower. It was being lost because submarines kept finding convoys. Anything that interfered with that process, even imperfectly, was worth quiet approval, rather than sweeping mandates. The Admiralty allowed experimentation. Modifications were authorized on select escort vessels. Results were shared cautiously. No public claims were made. No enemy attention was invited. This restraint was deliberate. The strength of the idea lay in its invisibility. Leadership did not need to believe the concept would end the U-boat threat. They only needed to believe it might by time. And time, in 1941 and 1942, was the most precious commodity Britain possessed. There are no front lines at sea, no civilians to retreat behind. A ship sinks or it does not. Survival depends on detection and on denial of detection. Bubble-based acoustic interference raised no moral debates in Parliament. It was not chemical. It did not target civilians. Yet it represented a subtle shift in how war was fought beneath the waves. It did not seek to destroy the enemy directly. It sought to blind them, to deny knowledge, to weaponize uncertainty. On doing so, it saved lives without demanding blood in return, at least not immediately. Merchant sailors who survived because a submarine failed to find them would never know why. U-boat crews who lost contact would never see the reason slip away. Behind a destroyer's wake, war's most profound effects are often invisible. And in this case, invisibility itself became the defense. As experimental systems followed convoys into hostile waters, the Atlantic remained violent and unforgiving, but no longer acoustically honest, and that dishonesty would soon be tested under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. By mid-1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its most dangerous phase. German submarines ranged freely along the American eastern seaboard and deep into the mid-Atlantic gap, where air cover could not reach. Allied losses surged again. Entire convoys disappeared with little resistance. The U-boats called this period Die Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. It was into this environment that acoustic countermeasures left the realm of experiment. Escort vessels fitted with crude bubble-generating systems began operating alongside convoys without announcement or expectation. These were not standardized devices. Some used modified exhaust outlets. Others employed compressed air systems jury-rigged by ship engineers. The goal was the same in every case: disturb the water enough to interfere with listening. On paper, it should not have worked. The ocean was too large. The submarines were too patient. The noise of war is too constant, but war at sea is rarely decided by theory alone. In the darkness off the coast of Newfoundland, German patrol logs began to show anomalies. Convoys detected late, shadowing attempts abandoned due to unreliable bearings. Sonar operators reporting diffuse noise fields where clear contacts should have existed. At the tactical level, the impact was subtle but immediate. A U-boat approaching a convoy relied on establishing a stable acoustic picture. When that picture dissolved, the commander faced a dilemma: close the distance blindly and risk detection, or fall back and search for a clearer target. Increasingly, commanders chose caution. In one recorded instance from late 1942, a U-boat reported losing contact with a convoy after intense escort maneuvering and abnormal background noise. No escort had fired a shot. No depth charges had been dropped. Yet the submarine disengaged. For the first time, Allied convoys were escaping without knowing they had been hunted. This was not a victory, but it was a disruption, and in a campaign where disruption could mean survival, the effect rippled outward. Escorts gained confidence. Sonar operators learned how to exploit noise. Convoy commanders adjusted formations, integrating acoustic interference with aggressive maneuvering. Sound was no longer a passive element of the environment. It was becoming a tool, and as these quiet successes accumulated, reports made their way upward, filtered, cautious, but impossible to ignore, because something fundamental was changing, and the Atlantic, long dominated by those who listened best, was beginning to answer differently. Allied convoy losses, while still severe, began to show irregular drops in sectors where new escort practices had taken hold. No single report credited bubble interference alone. That would have been misleading. The Battle of the Atlantic was never won by one idea, one weapon, or one moment, but beneath the surface, something profound was happening. German U-boat commanders increasingly complained, not of Allied firepower, but of uncertainty. Acoustic contact, the foundation of their entire doctrine, was becoming unreliable. Hydrophone operators reported that convoy noise appeared to smear across bearings, making it difficult to determine heading or speed. In some cases, sound seemed to originate from multiple directions at once. In others, it faded entirely during escort maneuvers, only to reappear minutes later in altered form. This was not silence, that it was acoustic chaos. When escorts combined bubble streams with hard turns, speed changes, and intermittent ASDICUs, submarines struggled to maintain situational awareness. The ocean no longer behaved like a predictable medium. It became deceptive. For a submarine commander operating on limited battery power, oxygen, and time, deception was deadly. Every failed contact meant wasted hours. Every aborted shadow meant lost coordination with Wolfpack elements. And as Allied air coverage expanded and escort numbers grew, those wasted hours narrowed the margin for survival. German records from the spring of 1943 show a marked increase in disengagements. U-boats broke off attacks, not because they were under fire, but because they could no longer trust their sensors. Several commanders described conditions as acoustically unfavorable, a vague phrase that masked growing frustration. At the same time, Allied escort commanders noticed something equally important. Convoys were being stalked. Less persistently, submarines that once lingered now withdrew sooner. Shadowing attempts collapsed. The sense of constant, unseen presence began to fade. This shift coincided with the integration of other countermeasures: improved radar, high-frequency direction, finding escort carriers, and later, dedicated noise-making decoys like Foxer. But the conceptual groundwork had already been laid. The ocean itself had become contested terrain, not through domination, but through denial. By May 1943, the U-boat arm suffered catastrophic losses. Dozens of submarines were sunk in a single month. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that conditions had turned against them. No report credited bubbles. No citation bore the name of a cook, but the principle endured. The Allies had learned that victory at sea did not always require seeing or destroying the enemy. Sometimes it required making perception itself unreliable. And once that lesson took hold, the Atlantic was never the same again. As the fighting subsided and the numbers were tallied, the true impact of these invisible measures began to surface, not in headlines, but in survival. When the immediate crisis of the Atlantic began to ease in mid-1943, the ocean did not suddenly grow safe. Ships were still sunk, men still drowned, but the relentless, one-sided slaughter that had defined earlier years had slowed. Convoys were surviving more often. This change was not attributed to any single innovation. Official reports spoke of layered defenses, air patrols, improved escort coordination, better intelligence, and refined weapons. But embedded within those layers was something less tangible, a growing ability to deny submarines a clear understanding of their surroundings. Acoustic interference had become routine. Bubble streams, noise generators, evasive maneuvers, and decoys were now part of escort doctrine. They were not always active. They were deployed selectively, adapted to conditions, and refined through experience. The goal was no longer to eliminate sound, but to manage it. German U-boats adapted as well. Some commanders attempted to close range more aggressively. Others relied more heavily on visual sightings at night. New countermeasures were explored. But adaptation took time, and time was exactly what the U-boat arm no longer had. Losses mounted. Between March and May 1943, German submarines suffered losses that outpaced their ability to train crews and commission new boats. Morale declined. Experienced commanders were killed. Survivors spoke of a sea that no longer behaved predictably. For Allied merchant crews, the change was quieter but no less profound. Survivability increased. Convoy routines became less fatalistic. Sailors still feared attack, but they no longer expected it with the same certainty. Confidence returned, not bravado, but belief that survival was possible. This psychological shift mattered. A war fought entirely in fear collapses inward. A war fought with cautious confidence endures. Escort commanders, too, adjusted their mindset. They no longer viewed submarines as omnipresent threats lurking just beyond detection. They believed they could interfere, disrupt, and escape. The Atlantic had not been conquered, but it had been complicated. And in warfare, complication favors the defender. As the shipping lanes stabilized and Allied industry surged forward, the quiet, unglamorous innovations of the early years faded from urgent discussion. They were absorbed into standard practice, their origins blurred by success. Yet beneath that normalization lay a truth that few would record. The battle had turned, not when the Allies learned how to hear better, but when they learned how to make hearing meaningless. Official histories were written, technologies were catalogued, credit was assigned often to the largest systems, the most visible machines. The decisions made at the highest levels. Radar took its place in the spotlight. Escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, advanced sonar. These were the tools that symbolized Allied triumph in the Atlantic. The quieter ideas rarely appeared in headlines. Bubble-based acoustic interference was absorbed into broader doctrines of noise management and counter-detection. Its principles lived on in post-war naval research, folded into studies of cavitation, wake masking, and later, Cold Warrior, acoustic stealth. Submarines and surface ships alike would eventually exploit similar physics using sound distortion rather than silence to evade detection. But the origin story faded. Wartime improvisation does not lend itself to peacetime commemoration. Ideas born out of desperation, tested crudely and refined in fragments, are difficult to document. There was no single blueprint to preserve, no dramatic demonstration to commemorate, and there was no incentive to elevate the individual who first voiced the idea. William J. Foster returned to civilian life with little recognition. Like many who contributed indirectly to victory, his role remained peripheral in official memory. He had not invented a weapon. He had not commanded a fleet. He had observed something ordinary and suggested it be used differently. The Navy, for its part, did not forget the lesson, only the name. Post-war naval architecture increasingly accounted for acoustic signatures. Ship designers studied wake turbulence. Engineers examined how exhaust, propellers, and hull shapes interacted with sonar. The ocean was no longer assumed to be neutral. It was an active participant. This shift in thinking, seeing the environment as something that could be manipulated rather than endured, marked a quiet revolution in naval warfare, and, like most revolutions born of necessity, it left behind few monuments, only survivors, only ships that made it home, and a war at sea that would never again be fought under the illusion. That sound told the truth as the Atlantic receded from crisis to history. One final question lingered beneath the surface. What does it mean when the simplest ideas leave the deepest marks? For the battleships, the bombers, the weapons that thundered loud enough to demand attention. But history is shaped just as often by quieter forces, by ideas that never explode, never announce themselves, and leave no wreckage behind. In the Battle of the Atlantic, survival depended on sound, on who could hear first, on who could interpret correctly, on who trusted the ocean to tell the truth. What changed the course of that war was not simply better listening. It was the realization that listening itself could be sabotaged. A layer of bubbles, a disturbance in water, an observation made without equations or rank. It reminded the modern war machine of something ancient, that nature is never neutral, and that understanding it does not always require mastery, only attention. The Cook's idea did not sink submarines. It did something more enduring. It bought time. It introduced doubt. It disrupted certainty in a war that thrived on it. Merchant sailors who crossed the Atlantic safely would never know why a U-boat failed to find them. German crews who lost contact would never see the distortion trailing behind an escort's wake. The ocean kept its secrets, and perhaps that is the point. History often credits victory to the loudest innovations, but beneath the noise, wars are also won by those who notice the small things, the way sound bends, the way water behaves, the way a simple disturbance can rewrite the rules of survival. In the end, the Atlantic was not silenced, that it was made unreliable, and in a war where listening meant killing, that unreliability changed everything.